Long before satellites drew lines on maps, human journeys carved the real borders of our world. Medieval travel routes were the hidden arteries of civilization, pumping belief, defining territory, and fueling betrayal across continents. This epic journey uncovers 26 of these forgotten pathways, revealing exactly how the movement of pilgrims, spies, and merchants built the foundations of our modern globe. You will discover how a pilgrim's faith could forge a cultural melting pot, how a merchant's greed could spark a war, and how a single whisper along a trade route could topple an empire. What invisible force do you think truly connects our world today? Every single journey began with a choice to face the unimaginable, to leave the relative safety of a walled town or a familiar village was to step into a world where the very landscape was an adversary. The roads themselves were a legacy of a fallen empire, the great Roman networks that once pulsed with legions and imperial messengers now cracked and overgrown, more often used by local farmers than by long-distance travelers. A merchant heading from Paris to Venice, or a pilgrim bound for Jerusalem from London, did not simply board a coach or purchase a ticket. They entrusted their lives to the mercy of dirt tracks that turned to rivers of mud in the rain, to narrow mountain paths where a single misstep could mean a fatal plunge, and to sea voyages on vessels that were little more than wooden shells at the mercy of the wind and waves. The pace of life was dictated by the sun and the stamina of one's own feet, or a horse if one was fortunate. A journey we now measure in hours could consume an entire season, each mile a hard-won victory against distance and fatigue. And the physical challenge was only half the story. Beyond every forest lay the threat of bandits, men who saw travelers not as fellow human beings but as mobile treasuries. There were no police, no emergency services, only the hope of safety in numbers, often found in large caravans or pilgrim groups. This constant shadow of danger, this daily negotiation with the unknown, is what makes the routes we are about to explore so extraordinary. They were not drawn on parchment by cartographers in quiet studies. They were forged step by painful step, their paths worn smooth by the countless feet of those who dared to move across a world designed to make them stay put. These were not just lines on a map, they were monumental achievements of collective will etched into the earth itself. Yet the chaos of the journey was not without a higher purpose. Every footstep, every perilous mountain pass, and every guarded city gate was part of a grander design shaped by three relentless forces. Belief, borders, and betrayal were the invisible architects of the medieval map. Belief was the engine, a spiritual hunger so powerful it could propel a peasant from Canterbury to Rome, or a scholar from Cordoba to Baghdad. It was the force that built the great pilgrimage roads, drawing thousands who sought redemption at a distant shrine, their collective faith literally wearing down stone pathways across Europe and Asia. Then came borders, the lines drawn by kings and caliphs, sometimes along rivers or mountain ranges, but more often defined by the very routes that crossed them. A trade path frequented by merchants became a de facto border, a place where cultures met, taxes were collected, and sovereignty was asserted. Yet these lines were constantly challenged, blurred by the very traffic they encouraged. And weaving through it all was the ever-present shadow of betrayal. A merchant caravan might carry a spy bearing secrets for a rival lord. A pilgrim's robe could conceal a soldier scouting a castle's defenses. The trust required to travel such vast distances was fragile, a currency as valuable as gold and just as easily counterfeited. These three forces were never truly separate. A route established for belief, like the Way of St. James, would inevitably attract merchants, turning a spiritual path into an economic corridor that defined the border of a growing kingdom. Conversely, a trade route forged for profit, like those crossing the Silk Road, became a conduit for religious ideas, where Buddhist sutras traveled west and Christian Nestorian scriptures moved east. To see them as isolated is to miss the point entirely. They were intertwined strands in a single, powerful rope that pulled the medieval world into new shapes, transmitting not just spices and silks, but the very ideas of power, faith, and belonging that would build our modern globe. Among these monumental pathways of belief, one name echoes louder than any other, a network of trails that carved its way into the very soul of Europe. The Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, was not a single road but a sprawling web of hope stretching from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, all converging on a single point in the far northwestern corner of Spain. The destination was the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, believed to hold the earthly remains of the Apostle James. For a medieval Christian, the promise of reaching this shrine offered a chance to erase a lifetime of sin, a spiritual redemption so powerful it justified any hardship. This was a journey undertaken by every stratum of society. A king might walk the same muddy path as a shoemaker, both united by a common hunger for divine grace. The journey itself was the penance, a physical ordeal that could last for months or even years, a test of faith measured in blistered feet and weary hearts. But the Camino's true impact stretched far beyond individual salvation. This river of humanity, flowing ceaselessly for centuries, became one of the greatest cultural exchange programs the world had ever seen. Imagine the conversations in a crowded pilgrims' hostel, a resting place known as a refugio. A monk from Ireland might share a meal with a merchant from Italy, while a French stonemason traded stories with a German knight. Ideas traveled faster than any single person. Architectural styles from France, particularly the majestic Romanesque design, were carried along the route and replicated in the countless churches, bridges, and hospitals built to serve the travelers. The local languages of northern Spain absorbed new words, and songs and stories from across the continent found new audiences. This constant flow of people required a sophisticated support system, turning a path of faith into a powerful economic engine. Towns along the route flourished, their economies built entirely on servicing the pilgrims. Bakeries, taverns, and markets sprang up to feed and supply the endless stream of visitors. The Order of Cluny, a powerful monastic organization, established hospitals and secured safe passage, effectively creating the first international tourism infrastructure. The wealth generated funded the very cathedrals the pilgrims came to see, creating a self-sustaining cycle of belief and commerce. The Camino de Santiago demonstrates with stunning clarity that a route born from pure spiritual yearning could not exist in a vacuum. It inevitably became a corridor for art, a marketplace for goods, and a social network that helped stitch a fractured Europe back together, proving that the footsteps of the faithful could indeed shape the world. While the Camino led west to the edge of the known world, another great road pointed the devout toward the very heart of it. The Via Francigena was the Archbishop's road, a direct line from the misty shores of England to the spiritual capital of Rome. This was not a path for the faint of heart, a brutal 1,200-mile journey that crossed the formidable barrier of the Alps. Its most famous traveler was not a common pilgrim but a powerful church leader, Archbishop Sigeric the Serious, who walked from Canterbury to Rome in the 10th century to receive his pallium, a symbol of his office, from the Pope. Sigeric did something extraordinary on his return journey. He meticulously recorded every one of his stopping points, creating a detailed itinerary that survives to this day. This document transforms the Via Francigena from a vague idea into a precise historical reality, a chain of 79 stages linking two worlds. The route served as the primary artery for northern Europeans drawn to Rome, the city of St. Peter and the seat of the papacy. Unlike the more socially diverse Camino, the Francigena was often traveled by a different class of wayfarer, clerics, diplomats, and scholars. Their journeys were missions of state as much as faith, strengthening the political and religious bonds of Latin Christendom. Every bishop traveling to Rome for instruction, every royal envoy carrying a message, reinforced the authority of the papacy across vast distances. The road itself became a physical manifestation of the Church's reach, a thread tying the distant kingdoms of England and France to the central power in Italy. To support this constant flow of important travelers, a network of hospices and monasteries grew along the path, especially in the most treacherous alpine passes. These were not just simple shelters, they were centers of charity and surprising intellectual activity. Monks in these remote outposts provided food, medical care, and safe lodging, but they also copied manuscripts and preserved knowledge. A scholar traveling from Paris to Bologna might find himself debating theology with a monk in the Great St. Bernard Pass, exchanging ideas high in the mountains that would later influence universities down in the plains. The Via Francigena demonstrates a crucial evolution. A route that began as a spiritual necessity for powerful individuals became the backbone for a unified European identity, proving that the road to Rome was also a road to power. But the roads of faith that crisscrossed Europe were merely local pathways compared to the colossal web of exchange that connected entire continents. The Silk Road was the superhighway of the medieval world, a sprawling network of land and sea routes that stitched together civilizations from the shores of the Mediterranean to the imperial courts of China. While its foundations were laid in antiquity, its medieval chapter was by far the most vibrant, a period when this conduit of belief, borders, and betrayal operated at a breathtaking scale. Think of it not as a single road, but as a river delta with countless branches, some crossing the brutal deserts of Central Asia, others skirting the mountain ranges of the Hindu Kush, and still others traversing the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. This was the ultimate two-way street of pre-modern history. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and exquisite porcelain crept westward, while merchants from the Mediterranean carried gold, glassware, and woolens east. But the most precious cargo was never weighed on a merchant's scale. It was the invisible freight of ideas, technologies, and faiths that hitched a ride with every traveler. Along these routes, Buddhist monks carried sutras from India into China, where their teachings would be absorbed and transformed. Nestorian Christians established communities deep in Central Asia, their stone crosses marking a Christian presence thousands of miles from Rome. And later, the vast knowledge of the Islamic world, from advanced mathematics to medical texts, would flow along these same paths into a Europe hungry for learning. This incredible exchange, however, played out in a borderland of astonishing complexity. The Silk Road was a space between empires, a shifting frontier where control was always contested. For a brief, remarkable period, the Mongol Empire established a Pax Mongolica, a Mongolian peace that secured the routes from one end to the other. Under this enforced unity, a Venetian merchant like Marco Polo could travel from Europe to China with a relative degree of safety, his journey made possible by the ruthless efficiency of the Khans. But this unity was fragile, built on a foundation of conquest that was inherently unstable. The very success of the route bred rivalry and, inevitably, betrayal. Competing Mongol Khanates turned against one another, local warlords reclaimed control of key passes, and the old threats of banditry returned with a vengeance. The fracture of this Mongol peace did not destroy the Silk Road, but it fundamentally reshaped it, forcing Europeans to seek new sea routes to the riches of the East and in doing so, accidentally mapping a new world. The Silk Road proves that the most powerful routes are those that carry not just goods, but the very forces that build and break empires. Far to the north, where the cold waters of the Baltic Sea washed ashore a golden treasure, another route pulsed with a quieter, yet no less transformative energy. The Amber Road was a river of sunlight frozen in stone, a path defined by the pursuit of fossilized resin that had captivated humanity for millennia. This was not a road built by emperors or popes, but one carved by the simple, universal desire for beauty. From the shores of modern Poland and Lithuania, where pagan tribes harvested the raw amber, the route snaked southward, crossing rivers and forests to reach the dazzling markets of the Roman Empire and later, the merchant princes of Venice. Amber, lighter than gold and seeming to hold captured light within it, was a luxury item that could travel vast distances without losing its value, making it the perfect commodity to fuel a long-distance trade network. The journey of a single piece of amber from a Baltic beach to a noblewoman's necklace in Rome reveals the route's complex nature. It would pass through countless hands, from the local gatherer to a regional trader, then to a major merchant who dared to move it along the established path. These traders were more than just businessmen. They were the first diplomats and spies between vastly different worlds. They learned the languages and customs of the northern tribes, and in return, brought back tales of southern cities with marble forums and aqueducts. This constant contact created a cultural exchange that was often peaceful, a slow blending of ideas at trading posts and river crossings. But such valuable traffic could never remain purely commercial for long. The immense profits to be made from controlling the Amber Road turned it into a geopolitical prize. Who would command this golden path? The answer shifted with the centuries. Ambitious city-states like Bruges and Lübeck saw it as the lifeblood of their Hanseatic League, a commercial network that would come to dominate northern Europe. But they were not alone. Military religious orders such as the Teutonic Knights saw a dual opportunity. They moved to control the route not just for wealth, but to forcefully Christianize the pagan peoples who lived along it. For these knights, conquest and conversion were two sides of the same coin, paid for with amber revenue. A trading post could become a fortress overnight, and a handshake agreement between merchants could be broken by the swing of a sword. The route itself became a border, a fluid line where economic influence and military power blurred. The Amber Road demonstrates a profound truth, that the quest for a beautiful object could forge empires, fuel holy wars, and ultimately draw a map of northern Europe that would last for centuries. The very lightest of cargoes could carry the heaviest of consequences. The Sahara was not an empty space, but a sea of sand navigated by masters of survival. While Europe journeyed along muddy paths, West African empires built their fortunes on a far more formidable highway, the Trans-Saharan trade routes. This was a maritime adventure on a solid ocean where ships were replaced by camel caravans and the waves were endless dunes. The journey was an epic undertaking that could consume months, a test of human endurance against one of the planet's harshest environments. Success depended on the deep, ancestral knowledge of the Tuareg and other Berber peoples who served as guides. They could read the stars for direction, identify hidden oases that were the difference between life and death, and navigate the shifting sands with an almost supernatural skill. Without them, the desert was an impassable barrier. With them, it became the most lucrative corridor in Africa. The caravans that crossed this burning expanse were immense, sometimes comprising thousands of camels. Their cargo defined empires. From the south came the legendary gold of West Africa, flowing from mines controlled by powerful kings. This gold would eventually fuel the economies of Europe and the Islamic world, becoming the very coinage of distant kingdoms. From the north came vast slabs of salt, mined in the desert and worth its weight in gold in the forested south, where it was essential for preserving food and health. And tragically, there was also a trade in human beings. A dark current of slaves moved along these same paths, yet the most enduring cargo was not material. These trade routes were the principal vector for the spread of Islam into sub-Saharan Africa. Muslim merchants and scholars traveled with the caravans, and their faith, along with its written Arabic language and legal traditions, slowly took root in the courts of African rulers. The king of Mali, Mansa Musa, became the most famous example of this fusion when his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century famously flooded the Middle East with so much gold it destabilized local economies for a decade. The wealth generated by this trade did not vanish into the sand. It built legendary cities that became centers of power and learning. Timbuktu was not a myth, it was a direct result of the Trans-Saharan routes. At its height, it boasted vast libraries and a university that attracted scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. Its reputation for intellectual achievement built on the golden foundation of trade. But such immense wealth was a magnet for conflict. The very caravans that carried gold were themselves moving treasuries, making them targets for desert raiders. The kingdoms that controlled the trade, like Ghana and later Mali, became phenomenally powerful, but that power attracted envy. Rival states plotted to seize control of the routes, and alliances between desert tribes and settled empires could shatter in an instant over a disputed tax or a stolen caravan. The history of this network is a cycle of magnificent achievement and brutal betrayal, all playing out under the relentless Saharan sun, where a single well could determine the fate of an empire. Their ships were not vessels of wood, but blades of water, slicing through the waves with a terrifying grace. The Viking sea routes were the antithesis of the established roads on land. They were fluid, opportunistic, and ruthlessly efficient, a direct challenge to the slow, earthbound pace of continental Europe. While pilgrims trudged along the Camino and merchants haggled in desert oases, the Norse were mastering a different element entirely. Their mastery of the sea was born from a unique combination of technological genius and sheer audacity. The longship, with its shallow draft and flexible hull, could cross the open ocean just as easily as it could sail far upriver, turning Europe's waterways into sudden, unexpected highways for attack and trade. This was not a single route but a sprawling network of possibilities, a web of seafaring paths that stretched from the fjords of Scandinavia to the shores of North America. One branch shot west across the treacherous North Atlantic, a leap of faith from island to island, first to Iceland, then to Greenland, and finally, around the year 1000, to a place they called Vinland on the coast of what is now Canada. This was the first European contact with the New World, a fleeting settlement born from exploration that remained a secret of the Norse for centuries. Another branch thrust east down the great rivers of what is now Russia, the Dnieper and the Volga. Here, the Vikings were not just raiders, they were founders. These river routes became the backbone of the Kievan Rus, a powerful state that served as the direct predecessor to Russia itself. The Rus, as these Swedish Vikings were known, did not simply conquer, they integrated, intermarrying with the local Slavic populations and laying the administrative foundations for a future empire. Their most famous journey was the path to Miklagard, what we know as Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Vikings who traveled there, serving as the emperor's elite Varangian guard, were a world away from the raiders who sacked monasteries. They became the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor, a symbol of how a path of violence could transform into a route of prestigious employment and cultural exchange. They brought northern strength to the Mediterranean and returned to Scandinavia with Byzantine silks, coins, and ideas, weaving the Nordic world into the fabric of a global economy. The true genius of the Viking routes lay in their duality. A single voyage could begin as a raid, a brutal, swift attack on an undefended coastal monastery for its silver and slaves. But that same ship, its hold now filled with treasure, could just as easily become a trading vessel, its captain negotiating peacefully at the next port of call. This seamless shift from plunderer to merchant was the core of their strategy. It was an opportunism that blurred every line. A trade route established one season could be used to launch a surprise attack the next. A settlement founded for farming in Iceland could serve as a staging post for exploration further west. This fluidity made them unpredictable and incredibly successful. Their legacy is not just one of destruction, but of profound connection. They linked the isolated islands of the North Atlantic to mainland Europe. They connected the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and the Caspian, creating a trade corridor that funneled Islamic silver coins back to their homelands. The genetic and cultural imprint of their journeys is still evident today, from the place names of Normandy to the parliamentary traditions of Iceland. The Vikings did not follow maps, they created them with the keels of their ships, proving that the most powerful borders are sometimes not drawn on land, but charted across the open sea. Yet the very sea routes that carried Norse explorers would soon be commandeered by a far larger and more organized force of belief. The Crusader routes were born from a fiery sermon and a desperate cry for help, creating a human torrent that flowed for 2 centuries from the heart of Europe to the shores of the Holy Land. This was not a peaceful pilgrimage but a mass military migration, an armed pilgrimage on an unimaginable scale. The primary path, the land route followed by the first waves of Crusaders, was a brutal slog through unfamiliar and often hostile territory. Armies of knights and vast crowds of followers marched across Europe, down through the Balkans, and into the precarious domain of the Byzantine Empire, their supposed Christian ally in Constantinople. The sea routes, controlled increasingly by the maritime powers of Venice and Genoa, offered a faster, though perilous, alternative, turning the Mediterranean into a highway for holy war. These pathways became arteries pumping not just soldiers, but an entire support system of blacksmiths, cooks, priests, and merchants eastward. The initial religious fervor that launched the First Crusade, the desire to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, quickly became entangled with more worldly ambitions. The routes themselves hardened into borders, both physical and ideological. The Crusader states established in the Levant, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, were European enclaves carved out of Islamic lands, their survival dependent on a constant flow of new recruits and supplies from the West. This created a permanent frontier, a zone of conflict where the line between Christendom and the Islamic world was drawn and redrawn in blood for generations. But within this cauldron of conflict, a surprising exchange flourished. European knights who had never seen a city like Antioch or Jerusalem encountered advanced Islamic architecture, medicine, and mathematics. They tasted new spices, learned new irrigation techniques, and brought these ideas back home. The Crusader states became a bizarre melting pot, a place where a Frankish knight might employ Arab doctors and where Italian merchants traded freely with Muslim suppliers, their business interests often trumping the official state of war. This constant, pragmatic interaction reveals the deep hypocrisy and the fundamental betrayal that ran through the entire enterprise. The greatest treacheries were often not between cross and crescent, but among those who supposedly shared the same faith. Crusader lords routinely betrayed one another, squabbling over land and plunder while their enemies watched and learned. The Fourth Crusade, perhaps the most infamous act of betrayal, never even reached the Holy Land. Instead, encouraged by Venetian merchants seeking to crush a trade rival, the Crusader army sacked the Christian city of Constantinople itself, mortally wounding the Byzantine Empire and shattering any pretense of a unified Christian front. A journey begun in the name of pure belief was ultimately corrupted by the very human temptations of power, greed, and political ambition, proving that even the most sacred of paths could be twisted into a road of conquest and deceit. While Crusader armies clashed in the Holy Land, a quieter, more pragmatic revolution was unfolding in the cold northern seas. The Hanseatic League was not an empire of faith or conquest, but an empire of pure commerce, a network so powerful it could bend kings to its will. This was a confederation of merchant guilds and their home cities, from Lübeck in Germany to Bruges in Flanders, bound together not by a common language or ruler, but by a single, unwavering pursuit of profit. Their domain was the water, a web of sea lanes and river routes that turned the Baltic and North Seas into a private trading lake. Their ships carried the essential building blocks of medieval life: vast quantities of salted fish from Scandinavia, thick furs from Russia, sturdy timber for ships and houses from the Baltic forests, and the most vital commodity of all, grain from the fertile plains of Poland, which fed the growing cities of Western Europe. This was bulk trade on an unprecedented scale, the medieval equivalent of the global container shipping that powers our world today. The League's genius lay in its organization. It created its own laws, a commercial code that was enforced in its own courts from London to Novgorod. It negotiated treaties directly with foreign powers, acting like a sovereign state. If a king dared to threaten the interests of a Hanseatic merchant, the entire League could respond with a devastating trade embargo, a non-violent weapon that could cripple a kingdom's economy almost overnight. This was the ever-present threat of economic betrayal. A city that had enjoyed decades of prosperity from Hanseatic trade might suddenly find its port closed, its warehouses empty, and its citizens facing hunger, all because its ruler had made a political misstep. The League's influence literally redrew the map. Cities that joined the Hanse flourished, their wealth visible in the magnificent brick guild halls and churches that still stand today. Those outside the network struggled. The economic border was not a line on a map, but a coastline, a river mouth, a port granted special trading privileges. The League proved that control over trade routes could create a form of power more subtle and enduring than that held by any army. It was a force built on mutual interest, but one that was always ready to sacrifice a partner for the good of the whole, demonstrating that in the calculus of medieval power, a ledger book could be mightier than a sword. Yet while the Hanseatic League mastered the northern seas, the true heart of continental Europe pulsed along a single, mighty river. The Rhine was more than a body of water. It was Europe's liquid spine, a natural highway that carved a deep valley through the very center of the medieval world. From the snowmelt of the Swiss Alps to the windswept ports of the North Sea, its current carried the lifeblood of nations. This was not a route one could easily avoid. For any merchant moving goods from the Mediterranean northward, or for any army marching from Germany into France, the Rhine was the fastest, most reliable path. Its banks became a stage where the grand drama of medieval power played out in miniature. Every twist in the river revealed a new castle perched high on a cliff, its walls staring down at the waterway it was built to command. These were not just noble residences, they were fortified toll stations, each one representing a tiny, independent border. A local count or bishop held the power of life and death over the commerce flowing beneath his walls. A merchant's barge laden with wine from Alsace or grain from the Rhineland plains would have to stop at a dozen such castles on a single journey, each time paying a fee for the privilege of safe passage. This endless series of micro-borders made trade expensive and slow, but it also created a constant, simmering tension. The river itself became a prize, its control fragmented among hundreds of petty lords who are all technically subjects of the Holy Roman Emperor, but who often acted as sovereign powers in their own right. This fractured authority invited constant betrayal. A bishop might ally with a French king against his own emperor to secure a more favorable toll agreement. A local knight could turn to piracy, preying on the very ships he was sworn to protect. The river's strategic importance meant that loyalty was as fluid as the water itself, easily diverted for the right price. Yet this chaotic system of control could not stifle the river's vitality. The wealth generated by this non-stop traffic fueled the rise of some of Europe's greatest medieval cities. Cologne, Mainz, and Strasbourg grew fat and powerful, their merchant guilds building magnificent cathedrals that reflected their economic might. The Rhine was a conveyor belt of culture, too. Ideas flowed as freely as goods. Monks traveling between monasteries carried new religious reforms upstream and down. The songs of minstrels and the techniques of master stonemasons moved from town to town, carried on the same barges that transported the region's famous red wine and the dark basalt stone used for grinding grain. To control the Rhine was to control the economy of Western Europe, a fact that emperors and kings understood all too well. Their endless struggles to dominate this liquid treasure turned the river valley into a permanent battlefield, a gorgeous landscape forever shadowed by the threat of conflict, where the reflection of a castle in the water was a constant reminder of the fragile balance between commerce and conquest. Speed was the ultimate currency of the Mongol Empire. A whispered rumor of rebellion in a distant province could blossom into a full-scale war if it took months to reach the Khan's ears. But the Mongols solved this problem of distance with ruthless ingenuity, creating a communications network that would not be rivaled for centuries. This was the Yam system, a state secret woven across the entire expanse of their domain. It functioned like a medieval internet, a hardwired network for the transmission of power. At its heart was a simple but brilliant concept, the relay station. Thousands of these posts were established along carefully maintained routes, each one a day's ride from the next. A messenger carrying his paisa, a passport of authority often made of gold or silver for high-ranking officials, would gallop into a station on a lathered horse. Without a moment's delay, he would mount a fresh, rested steed and continue his desperate ride, his vital message moving forward without pause. These riders could cover distances that were previously unimaginable, up to 200 miles in a single day, shrinking an empire that spanned continents into a manageable kingdom. The primary purpose of this incredible speed was control. The Yam was the empire's central nervous system, and its messages were the electrical impulses of command. A decree from the Great Khan in Karakoram could reach a general on the Russian steppes in a matter of weeks, not years. Tax collectors could send revenue back to the capital with unprecedented security. But most importantly, spies and scouts used the Yam to deliver intelligence, reports on the loyalty of local governors, the movements of rival armies, or the mood of a conquered population. This constant flow of information was the best defense against betrayal, allowing the Mongols to crush dissent before it could even organize. The system was so efficient that it inadvertently created the famed Pax Mongolica, the Mongolian peace. With the routes secured and banditry suppressed to protect the messengers, merchants found they could travel with a new sense of safety. Trade caravans began to shadow the official Yam routes, benefiting from the security the Mongols provided. This is why figures like Marco Polo could journey so deeply into Asia. Their paths were made safe by an infrastructure designed for espionage and military logistics. Yet this peace was a byproduct, not the goal. The yam was ultimately a tool of domination, a physical manifestation of the Khan's will that reached into every corner of his realm. It demonstrated that the most powerful routes are not always those open to everyone, but those reserved for the few who hold the reins of power, a network where the fastest-moving cargo was not silk or spice, but an order that could mean life or death for thousands. The taste of a single peppercorn could launch 1,000 ships. In the kitchens of medieval Europe, flavor was a form of wealth, and the most coveted tastes of all, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, grew only in a handful of distant islands known collectively as the Indies. This simple fact of geography created a desperate hunger that would shatter the old maps of the world. For centuries, these spices traveled a slow, convoluted path to European tables, passing through countless middlemen on the Silk Road and across the Indian Ocean, each hand taking a profit until the price became astronomical. To control the spice trade was to control a river of gold, and the merchant republics of Venice and Genoa grew immensely powerful by acting as the final link in this long chain. But their monopoly was a fragile one, dependent on the complex politics of the Muslim empires that controlled the land routes to the east. For any European power bold enough to bypass these middlemen, the rewards were almost beyond calculation. The quest was not for new lands, but for a direct line to the source of flavor itself. This required a monumental shift in thinking, from following established paths to forging entirely new ones across the trackless ocean. The first great breakthrough came from Portugal, a small kingdom with its back to Europe and its face to the Atlantic. Portuguese explorers began pushing further and further down the west coast of Africa, not for conquest but for a way around the continent. Each voyage was a leap into the unknown, with crews terrified of sailing off the edge of the world or into a sea of boiling water. The successful voyage of Vasco da Gama, who rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached the coast of India in 1498, was a moment that changed everything. He had done it. He had found the sea route to the Indies, and the news sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe. The old borders, the ones defined by land empires and caravan routes, suddenly became irrelevant. A new border was drawn, not on land but on the high seas, and it was fiercely contested. The immense profits at stake turned national rivals into bitter enemies. Spies were dispatched to steal navigational charts. Cartographers produced deliberately misleading maps to send competitors astray. A captain who discovered a new, faster route could become a hero, but if he shared that secret with a rival nation, he was the worst kind of traitor. This ruthless competition culminated in the creation of vast, state-sponsored trading companies like the Dutch East India Company, which were granted powers to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. They were empires in all but name, their flags planted not for God or glory, but for pepper and profit. The search for a kitchen ingredient had inadvertently connected the globe, creating a single, interconnected world economy for the first time. But it was a connection forged in the fire of rivalry and built upon the certainty of betrayal. A single spiritual obligation united millions across continents, from the rice paddies of Indonesia to the royal courts of Spain. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, was more than a journey. It was the fifth pillar of Islam, a sacred duty that etched a permanent pattern of movement into the heart of the medieval world. Every year, like a great heartbeat, the Islamic world pulsed toward its spiritual center. These were not disorganized treks, but monumental state-sponsored enterprises. The Caliph in Baghdad or the Sultan in Cairo saw the protection and provisioning of the Hajj caravans as a primary function of their rule. they would dispatch soldiers to clear the routes of bandits, dig and maintain wells across the arid deserts, and fund the construction of massive fortified way stations known as caravanserais, where pilgrims could find food, water, and safety for the night. A sultan's legitimacy was measured by his ability to keep these pathways open, to be the guardian of the faithful on their most important voyage. The caravans themselves were moving cities. The Egyptian caravan departing from Cairo could number in the tens of thousands, a river of humanity accompanied by thousands of camels carrying supplies, water, and the ornate palanquins of wealthy pilgrims. For months, this diverse multitude traveled together. A Persian scholar might walk beside a Berber farmer from North Africa, while a merchant from Damascus shared stories with a legal expert from Muslim Spain. Within the caravan, the rigid social hierarchies of the outside world softened. All were equal in their status as pilgrims, all wearing the simple white garments of ihram that erased distinctions of class and wealth. This annual convergence was the ultimate melting pot of the medieval era, a powerful engine of cultural and intellectual exchange. News, scientific ideas, and artistic trends traveled with the pilgrims. A new style of mosque architecture developed in Cairo could be carried by a returning pilgrim and replicated in a village in India. More importantly, the shared experience of the Hajj forged a collective identity, an ummah, that transcended the often fractious political borders of the various sultanates and emirates. It was a living reminder that despite local rivalries, they were all part of a single, global community of faith. Yet this very unity made the routes a target. Control over Mecca and the pathways leading to it was the ultimate prize, a symbol of supreme authority in the Islamic world. When a dynasty lost its ability to protect the pilgrims, its claim to leadership was irrevocably broken. The most devastating betrayal occurred in the 10th century when the Sarmatians, a radical sect, sacked Mecca itself, desecrating the holy sites and stealing the sacred black stone from the Kaaba. This act sent shockwaves through the entire Muslim world, a profound trauma that demonstrated how the most sacred of routes could be violated, and how the failure to protect them was the deepest form of political and spiritual collapse. The Hajj routes were the arteries of the Islamic body politic, and their health was the clearest indicator of its strength or weakness. While spices were luxuries for the rich, a different mineral sustained the very lives of the common people. Salt was the silent engine of medieval survival, a substance so vital that the paths it traveled became the hidden economic skeleton of the continent. Without it, meat could not be preserved for winter, dairy would spoil, and basic nutrition would falter. This absolute necessity created an intricate web of trade, the salt roads, leading from the great evaporation ponds on the coasts of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic to the deep underground mines of places like Hallein and Wieliczka. The wealth generated by this humble white crystal was staggering. A city's power could be measured by its grip on a salt route. Take Salzburg, whose name literally means salt castle. Its prince-archbishops grew immensely wealthy and powerful, not from gold or silver, but from their control over the salt trade flowing from the nearby Alps. They built fortresses not just for defense, but to oversee and tax every cartload that passed through their territory. The flow of salt dictated where people lived. Towns sprang up at river crossings where salt barges were unloaded, or at the mouths of mines where the mineral was brought to the surface. A village located a day's journey from a major salt source could thrive as a trading post, while a community cut off from the supply might wither. These economic realities created powerful, unofficial borders. Alliances between cities were often sealed not by marriage, but by mutual need for salt access. A landlocked duchy would form a tight bond with a coastal republic that controlled the sultans, their political fate tied to the steady flow of this essential preservative. But such control also bred resentment and rebellion. Because salt was a necessity, rulers saw it as the perfect commodity to tax. A salt tax was a heavy burden that fell on everyone, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest merchant. When these taxes became too oppressive, they sparked popular uprisings. The most profound betrayals occurred when a local lord, promised a share of the salt revenue, would grant safe passage to a trade convoy only to have his own soldiers ambush it, seizing the entire shipment for himself. The history of the salt roads is a reminder that the most profound power struggles are often fought not over glittering treasures, but over the fundamental substances that make civilization possible. A kingdom could be brought to its knees not by a siege army, but by the interruption of a convoy of rock salt. But the grand routes of kings and caravans were often preceded by the solitary footsteps of a single, determined individual. While empires moved armies, missionaries moved ideas, and their personal paths could reshape the spiritual map of an entire region. In the 5th century, a man named Patrick, who had once been a slave in Ireland, felt a calling to return to the island of his captivity. His mission was not to conquer with the sword, but to convert with the word. Patrick's journey was not along a single road, but a crisscrossing of the Irish landscape, from one tribal kingdom to the next. He traveled to the remote hill forts of local chieftains, engaging them in debate and earning their permission to preach. Where he found acceptance, he would establish a church, often a simple wooden structure that would grow into a monastery. This network of monastic settlements, places like Armagh and Downpatrick, became far more than just religious centers. In a Europe descending into the chaos of the so-called Dark Ages, where Roman libraries were burning and centralized authority was crumbling, these Irish monasteries became arks of knowledge. Monks within their scriptoria meticulously copied not only the Bible but also the works of classical authors, preserving the writings of Virgil and Plato alongside their own illuminated Gospels. Patrick's personal route of faith inadvertently created a circuit of learning that would eventually re-export literacy and scholarship back to a continent in need. A century later, a similar journey of conviction began from the opposite direction. In the year 597, Pope Gregory the Great dispatched a monk named Augustine and a small band of 40 companions from Rome to the distant pagan island of England. Augustine's mission was to re-establish Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons, a people whose ancestors had pushed the faith to the Celtic fringes. The route he took, from Rome to the Kentish coast and then to Canterbury, was a deliberate act of reconnection. By arriving with the explicit blessing of the Pope, Augustine was not just bringing a religion, he was reinstating a line of authority directly back to the heart of Christendom. His success in converting King Ethelbert of Kent was a masterstroke. Canterbury became the seat of the first Archbishop in England, and the path from its cathedral to Rome became the official artery of the English Church. This was more than a spiritual link, it was a political one. It tied the emerging kingdoms of England firmly into the European sphere, aligning them with Latin liturgy and papal influence rather than the older Celtic Christian traditions of Ireland and Wales. The route Augustine walked effectively drew a new religious border, one that would define English identity for centuries. These missionary trails demonstrate a profound truth, that the map of belief was not always drawn by crowds, but could be first sketched by the unwavering footsteps of a single person, whose personal conviction could indeed lay the foundation for a nation. The Byzantine Empire understood that a road was a weapon. While other routes buzzed with merchants and pilgrims, their most vital pathways were reserved for the legions. They inherited the magnificent Roman road network, but they did not merely preserve it, they weaponized it for a single, desperate purpose: to hold a line against the world. The empire was a fortress under perpetual siege, surrounded by enemies on all fronts, from the Persian Sassanids in the east to the rising power of Islam, and later the Seljuk Turks. Survival depended on one critical advantage: speed. An army delayed by a week could mean a province lost forever. This is why roads like the Via Egnatia, stretching from the capital Constantinople across the Balkans to the Adriatic Sea, were treated as strategic assets of the highest order. Imperial engineers constantly maintained the stone-paved surfaces, repaired bridges, and built fortified way stations. This was not a public service, it was a military necessity. A messenger could race along the Via Egnatia to bring news of a Slavic invasion in the west, and within days, the elite Tagmata troops from the capital could be on the march to meet the threat. The same was true for the web of roads crisscrossing Anatolia, the empire's fertile heartland and primary recruiting ground. These routes allowed Byzantine forces to intercept Arab raiders before they could penetrate too deeply, to reinforce besieged fortresses, and to project power far beyond the walls of Constantinople. The entire state apparatus was geared towards keeping these arteries clear. A local governor's most important duty was not collecting taxes, but ensuring that the roads in his province were passable for the army. Failure to do so was not just incompetence, it was treason. The empire's legendary Greek fire, its cunning diplomacy, its wealth, all of it was meaningless if its armies could not move. This system created a fragile kind of stability, a border that was not a static wall but a zone of rapid response. Yet this dependence on mobility was also the empire's greatest vulnerability. The road network was its lifeline, and a single cut could be fatal. When a key fortress guarding a mountain pass fell to Betrayal, when a local commander was bribed to look the other way, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. An enemy force could pour down an undefended road straight into the empire's core territories. The slow erosion of Byzantine power can be traced directly to the loss of control over these military highways. As Anatolia was lost piece by piece to the Turks, the roads that had once rushed defenders to the border now carried invaders inward. The empire shrank back towards the sea, its vast interior road network now in hostile hands, until all that remained was the city of Constantinople itself, a head severed from its body. The Byzantine military highways were a masterpiece of logistical planning, but they prove that the most sophisticated defense is only as strong as the loyalty of the man guarding the gate. High in the mist-shrouded mountains where China met Tibet, a different kind of currency changed hands, one measured in leaves and horsepower. The T-Horse Road was a network of trails so perilous they were often just footpaths clinging to cliffsides, a world away from the grand imperial highways of the plains. This was not a route for wheeled carts. Only caravans of sure-footed mules and human porters could navigate its dizzying switchbacks and rickety rope bridges. The exchange at the heart of this journey was brilliantly simple, yet it held the balance of power for two empires. From the fertile hills of Yunnan and Sichuan came tightly packed bricks of tea, a commodity the Tibetans craved. In their high-altitude homeland, a diet heavy in meat and dairy made tea an essential digestive aid, a daily necessity as vital as grain. In return, the Chinese empires, constantly threatened by nomadic cavalry from the northern steppes, desperately needed the strong, agile warhorses bred on the Tibetan plateau. This was a barter system born of mutual dependence, where one civilization's staple was another's strategic resource. The caravans that plied this route were microcosms of diplomacy. A single train might include Han Chinese merchants, Tibetan horse traders, and guides from the Naxi and Bai peoples who knew the secret passes. At trading towns like Lijiang and Dole, these groups would meet in bustling markets, negotiating not just prices but the fragile peace between their respective rulers. The Chinese emperor saw control of the tea-horse road as a matter of national security. By officially regulating the trade through a series of tea-horse offices, he could ensure a steady flow of war horses while also exerting a form of soft power over the often independent Tibetan chieftains. The supply of tea was a lever he could pull, a reward for loyalty or a punishment for defiance. This delicate balance was constantly tested. A local chieftain, tempted by the profits of a black market trade, might betray his agreement with the imperial court, diverting horses to a rival. Conversely, a Chinese official stationed at a remote outpost might hoard the best tea for himself, selling inferior leaves and risking a diplomatic incident that could halt the entire exchange. The route itself became a borderland of shifting allegiances, where a handshake deal over a cup of butter tea could be as significant as a signed treaty. Beyond horses and tea, the caravans carried something even more enduring: culture. Buddhist scriptures traveled south from Tibet into China, while Chinese architectural styles and agricultural techniques moved north. The tea-horse road proves that the most strategic routes are not always the widest or most traveled, but those that connect two worlds at their point of greatest need, creating a frontier where every load of tea was a transaction in trust, and every horse was a step toward either peace or war. A scholar's pilgrimage was measured not in miles but in manuscripts. While merchants chased spices and knights sought glory, a different kind of traveler began to walk the roads of Europe, their minds fixed on a more elusive prize: knowledge. The rise of the first universities in the 12th and 13th centuries transformed cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford into intellectual magnets, drawing students and masters from every corner of the continent. A young man from a village in Germany might spend years walking to the University of Paris, his journey fueled by the promise of studying logic or law under a famous master. This migration created a new map, one drawn not by faith or commerce, but by the sheer force of intellectual curiosity. These were the routes of the medieval university scholar. Latin was their passport. In the lecture halls of Oxford, a student from Scotland could debate theology with a peer from Italy because they shared a common language of learning. This universal tongue created what was called the Republic of Letters, an invisible republic with no borders, no armies, and only one currency: ideas. A master who taught in Bologna one year might be invited to a new university in Prague the next, carrying with him not just his personal belongings, but entire libraries of thought. The most precious cargo on these routes was knowledge itself, often traveling from unexpected sources. For centuries, the great works of ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Ptolemy had been preserved, studied, and expanded upon not in Europe, but in the great libraries of the Islamic world from Cordoba to Baghdad. It was through these scholar routes that this treasure finally flowed back into the Latin West. A Christian scholar translating an Arabic text in Toledo, Spain, was not just converting words, he was reconnecting Europe with its own forgotten intellectual heritage, a process that would directly fuel the Renaissance. This free flow of thinkers challenged the very notion of local loyalty. A student's primary identity shifted from being a subject of a particular king or duke to being a citizen of this international scholarly community. The university itself often acted as a sovereign power, granting protections and privileges that shielded its members from local laws. This created constant tension with town authorities, who viewed the influx of thousands of young, often rowdy students with deep suspicion. Town and gown riots were not uncommon, a physical manifestation of the clash between parochial beliefs and this new, borderless intellectual world. The routes these scholars walked were therefore routes of transformation in every sense. They carried the wisdom of the ancients, they spoke a language that ignored political divisions, and their very existence proved that the human mind could build connections far stronger than any wall. The next time you picture a medieval traveler, do not only see the pilgrim or the merchant, see the student, his pack heavy with books, walking toward a future he was helping to invent with every step. A diplomat's true weapon was his eyes. While merchants calculated profit and pilgrims sought grace, a new kind of professional traveler emerged, the diplomatic envoy, whose mission was to simply see and report. Two of the most famous, the Venetian Marco Polo and the Moroccan Ibn Battuta, walked many of the same roads we have explored, but they saw them through a unique lens, that of an observer tasked with understanding the world for those who could not go themselves. Their journeys were monumental feats of reportage, and the routes they followed were dictated entirely by the political landscape of their time. Marco Polo's path along the Silk Road was not one of random exploration. He was guided, protected, and at times constrained by the very Pax Mongolica that Kublai Khan's Yam system enforced. His journey was a direct result of Mongol authority, a testament to the safety their control provided. For 17 years he served in the Khan's administration, and his famous book, The Travels, was less a personal memoir and more an intelligence report for a European audience desperate to understand the staggering scale and sophistication of the East. He mapped the beliefs of Buddhists and Nestorian Christians. He detailed the complex borders of Mongol provinces, and he revealed the internal politics of a court where loyalty was the ultimate currency and betrayal was a constant, whispered threat. His route was a function of diplomacy itself. Meanwhile, the Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta embarked on an even more extraordinary 3-decade odyssey. His initial goal was a simple pilgrimage to Mecca, but his reputation for learning turned him into an impromptu diplomat for the various sultans and emirs he met along the way. His route was a sprawling tour of the entire Islamic world, from his home in Tanya to Mali in West Africa, to the Delhi Sultanate in India, and even to the distant Maldive Islands. He did not travel on official state business, yet he was continually absorbed into it, appointed as a judge in one kingdom, and sent as an ambassador to another. His detailed account, the Rihla, offers a panoramic view of the 14th century Muslim globe, a world connected not by a single empire, but by the shared pathways of faith, trade, and intellectual exchange. He meticulously recorded the nuances of local customs, the strength of different rulers, and the ever-present tension at every court he visited. For both men, the route itself was a character in their story. Their safety depended on the letters of introduction they carried, the fragile promises of safe conduct from one ruler to the next. A hospitable welcome at one caravanserai could be followed by a terrifying encounter with bandits on the next stretch of road. Their writings are filled with moments of profound generosity and chilling treachery, illustrating that the trust required to cross such vast distances was as delicate as a spider's web. The paths of Polo and Battuta did more than just connect points on a map. They connected worlds of understanding, proving that the most accurate cartography was often written not by a surveyor, but by a storyteller. The landscape itself was reshaped by the needs of the herd. Across the green hills of Britain and the plains of Europe, a different kind of highway emerged, one not paved for carts but worn smooth by thousands of hooves. These were the cattle-droving routes, the vital arteries of a booming livestock trade that connected isolated highland farms with the hungry markets of growing cities. A single journey could take weeks, moving vast herds of hardy cattle from the remote Scottish Highlands all the way to the bustling Smithfield market in London. This was not a simple matter of pointing animals south and hoping for the best. It was a highly specialized profession governed by the drovers, men who possessed an intimate knowledge of the land, the weather, and the animals in their care. The routes they pioneered were chosen with precision. They needed wide, grassy verges where the cattle could graze and recover their strength each night. They required specific stopping points known as droving inns with access to water and large holding pens. Over generations, these needs etched a distinct pattern onto the countryside, creating broad, green lanes that still crisscross the British landscape today, a silent testament to an age when the economy walked on four legs. This movement of beef on the hoof was a major economic force, a river of wealth flowing from the rural periphery to the urban center. The success of a single drove could make or break a local economy for an entire season. But such valuable traffic naturally created friction and informal borders. The drovers did not own the land they crossed. They negotiated passage rights with every local landowner along the way. A handshake deal granted access to a specific stretch of grazing land or a river crossing, turning the route into a zone of constant, delicate negotiation. The drover carried not just a herd but the collective trust of the community he represented. This trust was fragile. The theft of even a few cattle or a landowner suddenly reneging on a long-standing agreement was not merely a crime. It was a profound betrayal that could ignite local feuds lasting for generations. A blocked path could mean financial ruin for an entire valley of farmers who depended on the annual drove. The droving routes, therefore, mapped more than just a path to market. They charted the complex web of social and economic relationships that held rural society together, proving that the movement of animals could draw the truest borders of all, those of mutual interest and fragile trust. The calendar itself became a map for the ambitious merchant. Across medieval Europe, the most lucrative routes were not defined by geography alone, but by time, a yearly circuit of temporary cities that pulsed with a life all their own. These were the great fairs, with the Champagne fairs of France standing as the ultimate example. For a few weeks each year, towns like Troyes and Provence transformed from quiet provincial centers into the economic capitals of the continent. Merchants from Flanders arrived with their fine woolen cloth, Italians brought silks and spices from the east, and traders from Germany carried furs and timber. This was not random gathering, it was a meticulously scheduled migration. A merchant might plan his entire year around this circuit, packing his wagons in Lyon to reach the fair of Bar-sur-Aube in the spring, then moving on to the summer fair in Provence and finishing at the autumn fair in Troyes. His route was a loop of profit, timed to the seasons and protected by a revolutionary idea, the peace of the fair. The Counts of Champagne, who controlled the region, guaranteed the safety of all merchants traveling to and from their land. This was a temporary suspension of the normal rules of a violent world. For the duration of the fair, ancient rivalries between city-states were set aside, and the threat of banditry was replaced by the authority of the fair guard. Within the fairgrounds, a unique international law took hold. Disputes between a German and a French merchant were not settled by distant kings, but by special fair courts that delivered swift justice based on merchant custom, not feudal law. This predictable, secure environment gave birth to sophisticated financial instruments that we still use today. Because carrying large sums of gold was dangerous, merchants developed systems of credit. A trader could deposit his money with a money changer at one fair and receive a letter of credit, a piece of paper that he could then present at a different fair hundreds of miles away to receive his funds. This required an immense, fragile web of trust that stretched across borders. The entire system was a delicate balancing act. The Counts of Champagne grew immensely wealthy from tolls and taxes, but their power was entirely dependent on their reputation for fairness and security. A single act of betrayal could shatter this trust forever. If a count failed to protect a caravan from a rival lord, or if a fair judge was discovered to be corrupt, the news would travel faster than any merchant. The following year, the great field might stand empty, the flow of goods and gold diverted to a rival's fair. The routes of the fair circuit were not paved with stone, but with promises, and the entire commercial map of Europe could be redrawn by a single broken vow. A whisper could travel faster than any merchant caravan. While the great routes carried silk and scholarship, they also had a terrifying capacity to transport a far more sinister cargo, a contagion of fear. The path of the medieval witch accusation was not a physical road marked on any map, but a psychological trail blazed by rumor and paranoia, following the very same rivers and trade paths that had once fostered connection. An accusation made in a German village along the Rhine could, within weeks, surface in a Swiss town nestled in the Alps, carried by a trader sharing news at an inn or a traveling preacher delivering a fiery sermon. The idea of witchcraft itself was not new, but its transformation into a widespread, deadly panic was a medieval phenomenon, supercharged by the era's growing interconnectedness. Religious upheaval, like the Protestant Reformation, created a climate of intense suspicion where the devil was seen as an active, present threat. In times of hardship, a failed harvest, a stillborn child, or an outbreak of disease, communities desperately sought a cause, a scapegoat to blame for their suffering. The lonely woman on the edge of town, the herbalist with knowledge of healing plants, the neighbor with whom one had a long-standing dispute, these individuals became easy targets. The accusation was the spark, but the route it traveled provided the fuel. A single trial in one jurisdiction could serve as a blueprint for the next, with manuals for interrogators and descriptions of alleged pacts with the devil circulating along scholarly and clerical networks. This created a grim standardization of terror. The methods of torture, the specific signs looked for on a suspect's body, the very language of the accusations, all became horrifyingly consistent across regions, a dark testament to how quickly a bad idea could spread. This geography of fear drew new, invisible borders within once cohesive communities. Trust, the very foundation that allowed travelers to move safely, evaporated. A neighbor was no longer a neighbor but a potential enemy, a conspirator in league with dark forces. The road that once brought welcome visitors now brought the dreaded agents of the Inquisition or the secular court. The path of the witch hunt demonstrates the ultimate perversion of the medieval route, a channel built for exchange twisted into a conduit for betrayal, proving that the same pathways that could build a cathedral could also lead to the stake. For every armored knight marching to the Holy Land, thousands of ordinary Christians dreamed of a quieter, more personal conquest. Their destination was the same, Jerusalem, but their path was one of devotion, not dominion. This was the ultimate pilgrimage, a journey to walk in the footsteps of Christ himself. The voyage began not with a call to arms, but with a vow made in a village church, a promise to reach the site of the crucifixion and resurrection no matter the cost. The practical reality was a logistical nightmare. A pilgrim from England or France would first face a long overland trek to a port city, most often Venice or Bari in Italy. These cities had perfected the business of salvation, operating a pilgrimage industry that was as ruthless as it was efficient. A pilgrim would pay for his passage, sometimes years in advance, and then wait, often for weeks or months, for a ship to be filled with enough paying souls to make the voyage profitable for its captain. The sea journey itself was a trial by terror. The vessels were cramped and filthy, with pilgrims packed into the hold like cargo, vulnerable to storms, disease, and pirates. The accounts of those who survived read like adventure stories. They describe the terrifying sight of a waterspout, the joy of spotting the distant Mount Carmel, and the profound emotion of finally kneeling before the Holy Sepulchre. These diaries are priceless windows into the medieval mind, recording not just shrines, but the vibrant, complicated world they passed through. They noted the different customs of the Greeks in Constantinople, the strange foods in Muslim-ruled ports, and the ever-present tension of crossing from one ruler's domain to another. Their faith was constantly tested by more than just hardship. The threat of betrayal was a shadow that followed them from the moment they booked their passage. An unscrupulous ship captain might demand more money halfway through the voyage, holding his passengers hostage on a foreign shore. A local guide, hired for the final leg from the coast to Jerusalem, could easily abandon his charges in the desert once their payment was secured. Even fellow pilgrims might turn out to be thieves, preying on the trust of those who shared their sacred goal. This mapping of a personal spiritual ordeal onto the harsh geography of the journey was the pilgrimage's true meaning. Every treacherous mountain pass mirrored the struggle against sin. Every betrayal by a guide echoed the denial of Peter, and every sight of the holy city became a foretaste of heaven. The route to Jerusalem was not just a line on a map, it was the longest road a soul could travel. The golden river of amber did not simply flow south to Rome. A second, equally vital branch turned eastward, carving a path through the deep forests of Poland and Moravia. Its ultimate destination, the most dazzling city in the world, Constantinople. This southern extension of the Amber Road transformed a trade in luxury goods into a direct dialogue between two worlds. While Roman emperors had prized the fossilized resin, the Byzantine emperors in their capital on the Bosporus were equally captivated, seeing in the translucent stone a symbol of the sun's captured light, fitting for their court of immense splendor. The caravans that made this journey carried more than just raw amber. They transported masterfully carved beads, intricate figurines, and polished panels that would adorn the palaces and churches of the Eastern Roman Empire. In return, these same caravans became the primary conduit for Byzantine influence to seep northward. They brought back bolts of exquisite silk, woven with gold thread in imperial workshops, delicate cloisonné jewelry inlaid with precious gems, and most importantly, religious icons and relics. A Slavic prince ruling a wooden fortress in Krakow could now possess a gilded icon of the Virgin Mary, a tangible piece of the sophisticated Orthodox Christianity practiced in Constantinople. This was not merely trade, it was a transfer of prestige and divine authority. The route itself became a contested borderland of immense strategic value. Control over a key river crossing or a mountain pass along this path meant wealth and power. A Slavic chieftain who secured an alliance with the amber gatherers of the Baltic coast could position himself as the indispensable middleman, taxing every shipment that passed through his lands on its way to the Black Sea. This power was a magnet for both ambition and treachery. Rival princes would scheme to divert the trade through their own territories, betraying treaties and sparking local wars. The Germanic Knights of the Teutonic Order, pushing eastward with the dual mission of conquest and conversion, saw control of the amber flow as essential to funding their crusades against the pagan peoples of the Baltic. They built their stark stone castles not just as military strongholds, but as fortified toll stations on this golden road. The path from the Baltic to Byzantium thus mapped a fluid frontier where cultures fused under the pressure of commerce. The onion domes that would later define Russian and Ukrainian church architecture owe a distant debt to the Byzantine designs that first traveled north on carts laden with amber. The very allegiance of these emerging Central European states hung in the balance, pulled between the spiritual magnetism of Rome in the west and the dazzling imperial allure of Constantinople in the east. Every piece of amber that reached the Byzantine court was a silent witness to a journey of immense risk. a transaction that could build a kingdom or just as easily lead to its betrayal. The revolution arrived not on horseback but as a pulp of rags and water. Long after the great routes had carried silk and spices, they began to transmit a far more potent cargo, the secret of paper. This humble technology began its journey in China, where it had been perfected over centuries, a closely guarded state secret. Its path westward was not a swift conquest but a slow, deliberate migration, shadowing the very trade routes that had already connected the continents. Muslim artisans learned the craft from Chinese prisoners taken at the Battle of Tollas in the 8th century, and from there, paper mills began to sprout along the arteries of the Islamic world, in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. The route it followed was a map of cultural exchange, where the knowledge of how to transform flax and linen into a smooth, durable writing surface was more valuable than any spice. For centuries, Europe remained cloistered in its reliance on parchment, the laboriously prepared skin of sheep or calves. A single Bible might require the skins of hundreds of animals, making books rare, expensive objects, the preserve of wealthy monasteries and royal courts. The arrival of paper in Europe through two key gateways, Islamic Spain and the merchant ports of Italy, did not happen overnight. It was a quiet infiltration. In cities like Valencia and Zativa, Muslim papermakers produced a superior product that slowly gained acceptance. Italian merchants, always pragmatic, saw the commercial potential of a cheaper, more efficient writing material for their account books and contracts. This was not merely a change in stationery, it was a fundamental shift in the economics of information. Paper was democratizing. A university student could now afford to own a notebook. A merchant could keep detailed records of transactions. A government could maintain sprawling archives of tax rolls and legal decrees without bankrupting the treasury. The very nature of bureaucracy changed, becoming more extensive and powerful because it was now supported by an affordable medium. The route of paper's adoption perfectly traces the borders of influence. It flowed along the same paths that carried scholars and their ideas, reinforcing those intellectual highways. The rise of the first universities and the recovery of classical texts during the Renaissance were both fueled by the availability of paper. Yet this new accessibility also brought fear. Those in power understood that the easier it was to produce and distribute the written word, the harder it became to control it. Heretical ideas could be copied and spread with new speed. Critical pamphlets could circulate in towns, challenging the authority of both church and crown. The paper trail, once established, became a new frontier in the struggle for control. A border where the power of the word was finally unleashed from the scarcity of the animal skin. A microscopic stowaway hitched a ride on the very caravans that carried silk and spices. The story of the Black Death is not just a tale of a disease, but a chilling map of medieval connectivity in reverse. In the 1300s, the same trade routes that had nourished Europe with goods and ideas delivered a catastrophe that would hollow it out. The pandemic began its long journey in the steppes of Central Asia, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis circulated among rodent populations. It was the sprawling Mongol Empire, with its unprecedented movement of armies and supply trains along the Silk Road, that provided the perfect vector. A flea carrying the plague could jump from a marmot to a pack rat in a Mongol provision cart, and from there into a bustling trading city like Sarai on the Volga River. The very efficiency of the Pax Mongolica, the peace that made travel safe, now served to accelerate a deadly payload. From the Black Sea, the pathogen found its next vehicle in the sails of Geno's merchant ships. These vessels, the workhorses of Mediterranean commerce, carried more than just cargo from their trading post at Kaffa in the Crimea. As the legend goes, when the Mongols besieged the city, they catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls, a gruesome act of biological warfare that may have infected the defenders. Whether true or not, the Genoese ships that fled the outbreak carried the plague with them, first to the great port of Messina in Sicily, and then like a spark to tinder, to Marseille, Venice, and Genoa itself. The disease mapped itself with terrifying precision onto the arteries of human movement. A road used by pilgrims became a corridor of death. A bustling market town, once a hub of economic life, transformed into an epicenter of suffering. The plague ignored every man-made distinction. It did not care if a person was a king or a peasant, a devout cleric or an atheistic merchant. The walls of a fortified city, designed to keep out armies, were useless against a flea on a rat's back. The borders of belief meant nothing. The plague swept through Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities with impartial fury. The betrayal was absolute. The networks of trust that had allowed merchants to travel thousands of miles now served as a perfect transmission system for a silent killer. The result was a societal collapse on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. In just a few years, the Black Death killed perhaps half of Europe's population. Whole villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and the intricate economic systems built over centuries shuddered to a halt. The scarcity of laborers who survived gave those who remained unprecedented power, leading to peasant revolts and the slow crumbling of the feudal order. The pandemic demonstrated the ultimate vulnerability of a connected world, proving that the same pathways that built civilization could also deliver its unraveling. Their quest was not for land or trade, but for the perfect silence in which to hear the voice of God. While empires built roads and merchants plotted courses to market, a different kind of explorer set sail from the ragged western coasts of Ireland. These were the Celtic monks, and their vessels were not the feared longships of the Norsemen but small, fragile currachs, boats of wooden frames stretched over with animal hides. To step into such a craft and push off into the wild Atlantic was an act of faith so profound it defies modern understanding. They called it seeking the green martyrdom, a voluntary exile where the struggle against the elements was itself a form of prayer. Their compass was not the stars but divine providence. They would often set sail with no destination, believing the wind and waves would carry them to the place of solitude God had chosen for them. This is how, in the 6th century, a monk named Columba arrived on the tiny island of Iona off the coast of Scotland. From this remote outpost, he and his followers did not retreat from the world, but instead radiated their faith outward, establishing a monastery that would become a beacon of learning and a mother house for countless others. Further north, on the sheer, dizzying pinnacle of Skellig Michael rising from the sea off Ireland's coast, another community of monks built their stone beehive huts, living a life of breathtaking austerity, suspended between sky and ocean. Their achievements were monumental. In these isolated sanctuaries, far from the chaos of the collapsing Roman world, they became the guardians of civilization itself. In scriptoria battered by sea winds, they meticulously copied not only the scriptures but the works of classical authors, preserving the legacy of Greece and Rome through the darkest centuries. Their artistic genius flourished in isolation, producing masterpieces like the Book of Kells, its pages a riot of intricate, spiraling designs that seemed to mirror the endless waves of their ocean home. This network of sea routes, connecting Iona to Lindisfarne off England's coast and to other island monasteries, created a distinct spiritual geography of Celtic Christianity. It was a web not of power but of prayer, a quiet counterpoint to the noisy routes of armies and merchants. Their legacy is a map of devotion, etched not on parchment, but on the very surface of the sea, a testament to the idea that the most powerful journeys are sometimes those that seek not to conquer the world, but to comprehend the soul. The final map reveals a world far more connected than we ever imagined. A single merchant's journey could begin on the Hanseatic sea lanes, his ship loaded with Baltic timber. He might sell that timber in Bruges, where it would be purchased by a Venetian trader, whose galley would carry it across the Mediterranean. From a Venetian dock, the wood could be loaded onto a camel caravan following a Crusader supply route to the Holy Land, only to be purchased finally by a Mamluk sultan's architect in Cairo. That one log from a Scandinavian forest to an Egyptian palace traced a path that wove together 4 of our routes into a single, continuous thread of human enterprise. This was not a collection of separate lines on a map, but a single, shimmering web where every strand touched another. The pulse of this web was the movement of people, and their motives were forever intertwined. A pilgrim's faith might finance his journey, but it was a merchant's trade that provided the ship he sailed on, and a king's border control that determined the tax he paid at the frontier. A scholar's quest for knowledge in Paris was made possible by the stable trade routes that supplied the city with food and the affordable paper that carried his texts. Each route amplified the others, creating a feedback loop of connection. The stability of the Mongol yam system supercharged the Silk Road, which in turn fed the spice markets that motivated Portuguese explorers to seek a sea route, which ultimately redrew the entire world map. This interconnectedness was the era's greatest strength and its most profound vulnerability. The same web that carried silk and scholarship could also carry the Black Death, and a betrayal in a distant mountain pass could ripple across continents, toppling alliances and starving cities. The medieval world did not invent globalization, but it built its first fragile skeleton. These 26 routes were the bones of that skeleton, a network of belief, borders, and betrayal that taught humanity a powerful lesson, that our fates are inextricably linked by the paths we choose to walk. These 26 pathways form a hidden blueprint beneath our modern world. The borders on our maps, the languages we speak, the faiths we practice, and even the foods on our tables are all, in some way, the legacy of these ancient journeys. History is so much more than the static lines of kingdoms and the dates of famous battles. It is the story of dynamic movement, the constant, restless flow of people and ideas across deserts, mountains, and seas. It is the pilgrim's unwavering faith carving a road through a wilderness, the merchant's calculated risk opening a new sea lane, and the spy's whispered secret altering the fate of empires. These forces of belief, borders, and betrayal are not locked in the past. They are the very currents that continue to shape our globalized present. The next time you glance at a map, try to see beyond the political boundaries and city names. See instead the ghostly imprint of the Silk Road caravans, the deep ruts worn by countless pilgrims on the Camino, and the sea lanes charted by Viking longships and Hanseatic cogs. Every road we drive, every shipping route tracked on our phones, carries the echo of those first daring travelers. They mapped a world of endless complexity and connection, not with satellites, but with courage, curiosity, and an unshakable will to reach the other side of the horizon.